Trump came out of the meeting in Alaska saying there's going to be no ceasefire. The Russians are not going to accept the West giving Ukraine a meaningful security guarantee. So he's ended up in this giant mess as a result.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Andrew Napolitano's podcast and talked a little bit about why Trump, Putin, and Zelenskyy still can't agree to a peace deal in Ukraine. He gets into the remaining roadblocks to that path and what this means for the Trump administration and U.S. politics. So let's get into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
After they left the White House, both stated publicly that he suggested, and he himself admitted it on Fox News, the use of American military as a security guarantee in the post-special military operation Ukraine. Why would they, in their wildest imaginings, think that Russia would accept that any more than we would accept North Korean troops in Tijuana?
Who knows? I mean, when you listen to the discourse in the West about what's going on in Ukraine, you can only reach one conclusion, that these people are detached from reality. I mean, the Russians are not going to accept the West giving Ukraine a meaningful security guarantee. And I would imagine that Trump understands that. And really all he's doing is throwing the Europeans a bone while he slowly but steadily separates himself from both the Europeans and the Ukrainians. I mean, it's very important to understand what's going on here. I think Trump has come to the realization he cannot settle this war. He and Putin might be able to sit down and reach an agreement. But the problem that Trump faces is that he cannot convince the Ukrainians and he cannot convince the Europeans to accept that deal. So he's reached the point where I believe he thinks that it's best if the Europeans and the Ukrainians together, and remember that they're joined at the hip, that they deal with Putin. They want to fight him on the battlefield? Fine. They want to negotiate with him? Fine. But he, Donald Trump, is not in a position where he can settle this one and then force both sides to accept the deal.
All right, so there's a little bit I agree with and a little bit I disagree with here. So first of all, he's totally right that Putin will not accept a security guarantee from the United States and or European powers. It's like saying, hey, they'll just form a new NATO and guarantee the same things that NATO does, in terms of its allies in Ukraine, and have the same powers constitute that new security guarantee. It's just absurd. It's just creating a new NATO and calling it something else with the same stipulations, including an Article 5 style, alliance. And that is the clause that they would invoke to produce a hot war. It's not going to happen. Putin will never accept it. And I think it's a poison pill. So that's where I disagree with Mearsheimer to an extent. I don't necessarily think that this is indicative of Trump throwing a bone to the Europeans and gradually distancing himself from Ukraine. I think it's actually an excuse to poison the potential for a peace agreement. I hate to say that, but that's where we're at. It's already 7 months of funding Ukraine. It's not something that Trump has shown any propensity to stop outside of that 6 days or whatever back in February to early March when Zelenskyy went into the White House, act like he owned the U.S. Treasury, and Trump said, you don't have the cards to play here. I don't think that's that. I think that the military-industrial complex continues to pressure Trump, and he's not willing to walk away with this and stop funding the Ukraine yet.
Do you think that the hour-long lecture that he got from Vladimir Putin, which was probably similar to that 45-minute answer President Putin gave to Tucker Carlson, essentially a history of the region seen through Russian eyes, motivated him to drop his demand, Trump's demand for an immediate ceasefire, demand he had repeated as recently as 2 hours before when he was still in Air Force One, and dropped the demand of some relationship between NATO and Ukraine?
My answer to you is yes and no. I don't think that Putin would be foolish enough to lecture Trump. I think that if you watched how Putin behaved in Alaska and just how he behaves generally, he operates in a very subtle and sophisticated way. And I think he clearly understands that lecturing Donald Trump is not the way to do business with him. I think, however, that the meeting in Alaska was an opportunity for Putin to explain to Trump in considerable detail what the Russian position is, number one, and to two, make it clear to Trump that the Russians were not going to compromise. For example, on the whole business of a ceasefire, the Russians have long said that they would not accept a ceasefire. But people in the West, and this included Donald Trump, couldn't get it through their thick skulls that the Russians wouldn't accept a ceasefire. But as you well know, Trump came out of the meeting in Alaska saying there's going to be no ceasefire. Now, why is that the case? I think it's because he heard loudly and clearly from Putin in a respectful way that there was going to be no ceasefire, that there had to be a final peace agreement or the war would continue. So I think that the meeting was very important for both Trump and Putin in the sense that Putin got to make it clear to Trump what exactly the Russian red lines are.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. First off, when it comes to Putin, that's exactly right. He is cool and calculated and meticulous. Whatever else you want to say about Putin, he's everything Trump isn't. He isn't bombastic and erratic and, throws out radical rhetoric all the time. He makes calculated decisions calmly. As far as the ceasefire, that's actually, I think, the most hope-inspiring thing to come out of this is that Trump isn't talking ceasefire anymore, because that truly was a diversion. It was a diversion months ago when he floated that idea and Putin came back and said, hey, we won't agree to a ceasefire. Here are terms to a peace. And they're essentially the same. No Ukraine and NATO, demilitarization and denazification, take out all the NATO resources from Ukraine, etc. That hasn't changed whatsoever. So that is actually a hopeful thing, that Trump seems to have gone away from this ceasefire idea. But knowing Trump, who knows, he might revive it again when the Marco Rubios and the Keith Kellogg's of the world are back in his ear talking about new diversionary tactics to keep this war going. It is going anyways, but that's another avenue to kind of keep it in the zeitgeist of continual funding.
So how does this end? It's probably going to end in the battlefield, not on a conference table. When I say this, I mean the special military operation. It'll end when the Ukrainian military collapses or the Russian military has achieved its goals, whichever happens first.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to get a ceasefire. That's clear.
Right.
The Russians are not going to accept a ceasefire. So that brings us to the question of whether or not we're going to get a negotiated settlement. We're not going to get a negotiated settlement because Russia's position versus the Ukrainian/European position is so far apart, or they are so far apart, that there's no way you can come up with a compromise settlement.
Wouldn't Rubio and Hegseth and the people that advise the president have told him that? Or was his purpose, notwithstanding the publicly stated bravado, in going to Alaska and meeting President Putin, some other purpose, breaking down the wall that Joe Biden had erected between the two countries, expressing some sort of a warmth and bonding with his opposite number, a prelude to a grand reset between the two countries commercially, culturally, etc., independent of Ukraine.
I sure hope so. I want to hear from Mearsheimer on this, but Trump didn't act that way in the weeks preceding this, talking about new sanctions and new secondary tariffs, etc. I hope that was an ancillary subject, or maybe even the primary one discussed, and that is a new road forward where the U.S. can normalize relationship with Russia. But I don't know if that's possible in any stretch of the imagination, as long as the U.S. continues to fund Ukraine. That's going to be a big roadblock to any commercial negotiations, I would think, as well.
The question you're asking is, what did Trump know before he met Putin in Alaska? And I think the key person here is Steve Witkoff. Witkoff went to Russia many times, and he met with Putin. Putin surely explained to him what the Russian position was. And in addition, the Russian position was in the public record. It was very clear what the Russian position was. There's no confusion here. We've known for a long time, at least since last June 14th. This is June 14th, 2024, what the Russian position is. So
Right.
you expect that Witkoff was fully aware and that he would have briefed Trump and that they would have began to push American policy in a direction that could accommodate the Russian position so that we could work out some sort of deal. But that did not happen at all. And in fact, if you listen to what Witkoff has been saying over the period since Trump moved into the White House and he became the principal advisor on the Russia issue, it is hard to square with the argument that Witkoff understood what was going on.
You know,
And therefore, I don't think
Mearsheimer,
Trump really understood what was going on.
you have forgotten more than Witkoff knows. I mean, he just doesn't know the history. He may be a great builder and a nice negotiator and a good friend, and he may have impressed President Trump. Could you compare him to your knowledge or Sergei Lavrov's knowledge?
Definitely not compared to those two's knowledge about this conflict, that's for sure.
He just doesn't have the grasp. It would be impossible for him to have achieved the knowledge of Russian history and culture in 6 months that you and Lavrov have in 40 or 50 years.
I think that's absolutely true. But the thing is, I don't believe he needed all that knowledge just to understand the Russian positions. You and I have lots of really smart friends who are capable of operating in a rational, legal way. They don't know much about Russia at all, other than what they read in the newspaper. I believe you could take those smart friends of ours and send them to Moscow and have them meet with Putin 3 or 4 times and have them read the newspapers every day. And they would figure out very quickly what the Russian bottom lines are.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with this too. It's like Judge said earlier, some of this comes down to the basics. Like, we would not allow the Russian government to overthrow the government of Mexico and insert one that was more antagonistic toward the United States. And then thereafter, send Mexico weapons, dual purpose ballistic missiles, in fact, that have the potential to be outfitted with H-bombs. We would not allow that. We would not allow with them flirting to put Mexico into their military alliance. A lot of this comes down to the basics of diplomacy and geopolitics, and that's not something that, can't be easily gained if you're on the top levels of the U.S. State Department or diplomatic parties.
And they would then set in motion a policy process for figuring out how to best deal with the Russians.
Do you think that Donald Trump had the remotest understanding of Russian history from Witkoff before he heard it from Putin?
No.
I don't think Donald Trump knows much about Russian history at all. I don't think he knows much about what's happened since the Cold War ended in terms of U.S.-Russian relations. I believe that he has a lot of false pictures in his head about this relationship.
Yeah, exactly. He's not an ideological creature at all. He's a real estate mogul, and he acts like every deal that you'd be dealing with, regardless if it was in the corporate world or in the geopolitical world, is based on precepts that he laid out in The Art of the Deal, and erraticism and the idea of injecting radical rhetoric in the hopes that your opponent comes to the table with a better deal. Well, that hasn't happened with Russia whenever he's tried it in regarding to sanctions and, secondary tariffs and all this other nonsense of security guarantees. So it clearly isn't working here.
But the fact is, he's the president of the United States, and it's his responsibility to learn about this situation, to appoint smart advisors, and then figure out how to get out of this mess that Joe Biden created. But he, instead of doing that, came into office arguing that he was going to shut this thing down overnight, giving the impression that it was an easy problem to deal with, thinking that he could appoint people who had no experience and that they would be able in quick order to solve the problem and so forth and so on. So he's ended up in this giant mess as a result.
Yeah, I mostly agree with with Mearsheimer at the end. The place where I'll disagree with is he said that this was Joe Biden's fault. And Biden, don't get me wrong, deserves a lot of the culpability and blame for getting this situation between Ukraine and Russia to the point that it is. But Trump bears some responsibility, too. It was him that withdrew from the INF treaty in his first term, slapped new sanctions on Russia for taking Crimea, despite that's what the Crimeans wanted, by the way, for, antagonizing Russia by saying, you should be denounced for giving Snowden asylum and for pumping in $400 billion worth of arms, including offensive purpose arms, into Ukraine in his first term. Now, again, don't get me wrong. Biden exacerbated and escalated this situation completely. But Trump deserves some blame, too. So does Bush for saying, both Georgia and Ukraine will be part of NATO in the Bucharest summit. And I think that was in 2008. For, the Obama administration essentially flirting with Ukraine and NATO as well. This has been a long-term, bipartisan foreign policy aim of the United States. Now, the thing is, the only thing that Trump can do to solve this is pull out of Ukraine. I think that Mearsheimer is right. We might not see a negotiated settlement to this war, at least when the U.S. is a party, a belligerent in this war, in the frame of mind that the Russian government has toward it, right? So if the U.S. withdraws, that will basically force the hand of Zelenskyy and the Europeans, I do think, to come to terms. But as long as the U.S. is bankrolling it, I don't think they're willing to do that. So the America First solution and the pro-peace solution is to withdraw all resources and funding to Ukraine. I just think it's that simple. Russia won't even respect the U.S. as a negotiating partner as long as it's on clearly one side of this war. And all the times that the Democrats still call, Trump a Russian agent, despite the facade that was the Russiagate hoax, no matter how many times they do that, he's still funding Ukraine. He's still funding Ukraine in this war, no matter how many times you slice it. And the only way out, for America's sake, and the America First solution, if you ask me, is to stop funding Ukraine. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Do you think Mearsheimer's right about this? Do you think this whole thing's indicative of a shift away from this theater by Trump? Do you think that, the security guarantee is a poison pill, as I do, that will prolong this conflict? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Judge Napolitano. I love his podcast, and thank you for interviewing Mearsheimer. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. And in return, I'll give you access to all my members-only videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.